begin with, I grew up on Wilkinson Road, just south of Miller Avenue, which at that time was the cutoff boundary for the Royal Oak School District. Therefore, I attended Strawberry Vale School until grade 8, and the last grade 8 held there, and the only pupil in that grade that went on to high school. So I rode my bike for 3.5 miles to Mount View High, which was an enormous school to me at that time. And it was a feeder school for 7 Saanich schools. I think there was about 200 of us in that first grade. And out of the 68 pupils in the grade 12 graduation class, there was just 12 of us that were accepted for university studies, which we started out with Victoria College. As a child, I had friends that lived in the Royal Oak area and often joined them in their various activities, like playing on the ice on Quick's Pond. I don't know whether any of you here ever skated on the ice that formed over the ported, I guess the Panama Flats in the, did you Sheila? Because they used to build these enormous bonfires by the lake, and people used to roast potatoes. And it was sort of a nice place to warm up too. And I waded in the Colquitt's Creek while the boys shot the raccoons, and picked berries out for 70 cents a day out on the old West Saanich Road, and of course swam in Beaver Lake, and I guess I attended the annual Saanich School sports events, which happened on that enormous slab of cement that lay out in front of Beaver Lake. I don't know how many of you remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Three-legged races.
Three-legged races, oh my gracious. Okay, and I'm looking at all the school photos that Darrell Foster here has put up on the website. It's just, I was quite surprised to see how many families that I recognized. And of course many of the parishioners down at Wilkinson Road United Church, I think half of them came from the Royal Oak area. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some early history of Royal Oak to begin with. And without going into too much of Victoria's early history, it's important to know it wasn't until 1852 that North and South Saanich were purchased by Sir James Douglas after signing separate treaties with the Indians, or today First Nations people. Then early land settlements could take place. Settlers were allowed 100 acres each, 200 acres if you were married, and the price to be paid by the preemptor was 4 shillings and twopence, which was roughly $1, although this land was purchased from the Indians for 1 cent an acre. Most of the settlers had already served their time with the Hudson Bay Company, and for this they received a further grant of 50 acres. And some of the earlier settlers who had squatted on their land in this particular area, and others of course, before the land survey was made, were allowed to preempt the land or choose elsewhere. So during the 1850 to 1860 period, this area known as the Lake District eventually became Royal Oak. It was covered with thick forests of cedar, Douglas, fir, and pine. Wolves as well as bears, cougars were a common sight. Also elk and deer were prolific. There were no roads, only Indian trails, therefore early settlement still seemed remote. Two of the earliest settlers to farm in what became Royal Oak was James Murray Yale, born in 1796, a Canadian from Ontario, and his son-in-law Henry Newsham Piers. Now both of these men had served as chief factors with the Hudson Bay Company, and Yale for 30 years at Fort Langley. where he married the daughter of a Kwantlen chief. They had 2 daughters, but in time his wife returned to her people, and their daughters were sent to Fort Victoria to be educated. Now the Peers settled Colquitt's farm in the 1850s, and that was located just outside here on the West Saanich Road before you came to the intersection of Wilkinson. Because in those days, Wilkinson Road beyond Kerry Road up to West Saanich Road was pretty well a rough trail. But his land, of course, stretched across both sides of that trail. And Peers also owned large sections of land and along other parts of Wilkinson Road. But both of the Peers unfortunately died very young in the mid-1860s. And Yale's considerable acreage just north of Colquitt's farm, that would be on the north side of West Saanich and Wilkinson Road intersection, he called it Stromness Farm. And Yale was a very wealthy man at that time, living in retirement. And on this land he built a 2-story house with a large number of windows, 27 of them to be exact. John Todd, another well-known Hudson Bay Company chief factor and a very, very close friend of Yale, said, Yale's house made his look poor by comparison and found the whole effect ostentatious. Today, Todd's very small house still stands on Heron Street, which he called the Willows, and of course today, you know, that whole district of Oak Bay has taken that name. Now, Yale was known always as Little Lael. He was often described as standing not 5 feet tall, but was a very courageous man. He wasn't at all interested in social life. Much of his time in Royal Oak was spent in seclusion until his stroke of 1868, which left him partially paralyzed. And his 2 daughters in Victoria had no interest in him whatsoever, saying his mind continually wandered back into his past adventures with the Hudson Bay Company. Then Todd would often come out to look after his old friend until Yale died in 1871 after being mauled by a bear on his property, and he was 75. And of course Yale on the Fraser Canyon, as you possibly all know, was named after this man. In order to cover as much information as possible about the development and the success of the Layritz Nurseries, I've decided to share with you various sections from a much larger biography I prepared a number of years ago for the Saanich archives, and it's there for anyone who wants to study it. So, for many years the name Layritz was synonymous with Victoria, the city of gardens. In 1889, Richard Layritz started his well-known nursery here, later to become a master gardener, a botanist, and a world-renowned horticulturist. And few, if any, of the early nurserymen on the West Coast were better trained. He was the youngest of 8 children, born on April 27, 1867, into a well-to-do, multilingual family with a background in textile manufacturing. They owned a large textile mill, and in the legal profession, in Hermstein-Ernstall near Dresden. His father realized his son had inherited his love of plants, especially the roses that grew around the country home where the family spent their summers. But his father died when he was 15. Later, Richard's older brother, now a lawyer, arranged for him to begin as thorough a training as any young man could obtain in Europe at that time, beginning with horticultural college in Stuttgart for a couple of years. He then apprenticed at the Scots Nursery in Berlin, at that time the largest nursery in Europe. He often said while he acquired a good grounding in horticulture, he also learned the value of hard work. Next, he traveled and studied in France, paying particular attention to the French formal gardens. And if he hadn't taken a side trip to England to look at horticultural developments there, and read the CPR posters' impressive tales of emigration to Canada, with the great posters with the well-known slogan, "Go West, young man, and grow up with your country," he might never have come to Victoria. He left for Montreal, where he worked in a nursery for the City Parks Department for a year before coming west. First he looked around Kelowna, where he was told the winters were too cold for tender plants. So he came on to Victoria, where he began a small nursery near Ross Bay Cemetery, which is the Fairfield Shopping Centre today. But that first winter was exceptionally cold and cruelly frosted, that first venture. Victoria and the surrounding countryside was a beautiful place in the horse and buggy days, in spite of the rugged and unpaved roads. Although rural, there were scattered farms about. And on a spring day in 1889, Richard took a buggy ride out the Burnside Road onto Wilkinson Road as far as the intersection of Carey Road, which was pretty well the end of the trail. And there he saw the land that he wanted. It laid before him. He purchased from the Lake District the first unit of 14 acres out of Section 98. And this land originally was owned by Henry N. Pierce, an acreage of 109 acres, purchased in 1858 for £87, 5 shillings and 5 pence. In time, most of this land became the part of the Layritz home nursery. The first years were not easy for this young man, as the land was virgin forest and had to be cleared by hand. During the first year, he managed to clear only 1 acre by removing brush, cutting down the larger trees, and setting dynamite to the stumps. Far into the night, the great bonfires would burn away the slash. On one of these nights, the fire attracted 2 native peoples. They had been fishing in Colquitt's Creek. I often wonder if they thought he was on their land. As a child wandering about on the nursery property, I remember finding arrowheads and the heavy round stones used for pounding food. Richard Layritz was my great-uncle and used to tell me tales of these early years, including the small native burial ground at the corner of Wilkinson and Lone Home. If you people that don't know where Lone Home is, it's just about a block south of Wilkinson Road Church. As children, we used to gather the loveliest, sweetest little wild strawberries off those burial mounds. Today there's 2 houses built over that area, and I often like to go and knock on the door and ask them if they have any idea what's beneath their basement, but I've never done it. I don't know how Richard lived during that first summer on his land, but by winter he helped to build a primitive 2-story shack with 1 room up, 1 room down that he shared with his Chinese cook for 2 years. In 1891, a carpenter was hired to construct the first wing of the house he would live in for the rest of his life. In the first years of the nursery, the main production was fruit trees, and perhaps the main project was clearing land. During these early lean years, it was often difficult to keep ahead of the game. In the early 1890s, Victoria was going through a recession. There was little money around for buying plants. People were more interested in buying bread to feed their family. And then in 1893, the smallpox broke out in the city, and yellow pestilent flags appeared at the doors of many homes, others flying from the masts of the ships that were anchored at sea. In May of 1896, the Point Alice Bridge which of course today is the Bay Street Bridge, collapsed, and the city suddenly found itself faced with hundreds of thousands of dollars of lawsuits, followed by bankruptcies. The nursery came to a standstill. It was time for a change. During the spring of 1898, Richard Layritz decided to shut his nursery business down and join the Yukon Gold Rush. Earlier, he had received one of the 200 special invitations sent out to businessmen to attend the opening ceremonies of the new provincial legislature for February 10th, 1898. And here's the little invitation. I still have it here. Beautiful thing. Opening of the new Parliament buildings, Victoria, British Columbia, 1895. Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, Mr. Speaker, requests the pleasure of the company of Mr. Layritz on Thursday, February the 10th at 3 p.m. at the opening of the Parliament buildings, Victoria, BC. And then it goes on, it shows you a picture of what the original legislature looked like. That would be before the extensions. And then there's a list of the various members of Parliament here. It's rather fragile, but I will pass it round if anyone would like to look at it, because it is an archival piece. So he's going to set off for the Yukon here. The streets of Victoria seem to be without reason. It was the best port of embarkation and in which to purchase supplies for the Klondike. An unusual assortment of people, many unsuitably clothed, began to gather around the docks or at the customs house on Wharf Street, waiting to obtain permission to board one of the ships heading north. Each man was required to pack enough supplies to last him for 1 year, keep him alive for a year. And Richard didn't pan, sluice, or dig for gold. He worked with the pack horses. And he told me of the cramped and overloaded ships, the terrible cold up north, and living on frozen potatoes for weeks on end. The following year he had saved sufficient cash to return home, pay off his debts, hire help, and get his nursery effectively launched. And from this point onward he never looked back as his dream slowly became reality. After the turn of the century, a great economic change was most evident throughout all of Victoria. Hundreds of businesses were competing with each other as the city expanded and prospered. The depressions of 1893 and 1907 had some minor effects on Victoria, but the real estate boom between 1907 and 1913 was significant. And even in the earliest days of Victoria, there were prosperous people living in the city who were able to purchase large properties. And as these early settlers became more established, they slowly built beautiful homes on their lands. The climate here was perfect for growing all kinds of plants, and people tried to reproduce the gardens that reminded them of the country they had left behind. The Dunsmuir families, many Victoria homes, and numerous other prominent citizens with the renowned gardens became Layritz clients. And the nursery ledger books over the years of 1913 to 1919 show some 40 identifiable clients of architect Samuel McClure that purchased their nursery stock from Layritz. Today, of course, it's difficult to trace what came from where, although it's positively known that the gardens developed in 1906 around the newly constructed government house, the Crystal Gardens in 1925, and the newly development, of the uplands, which began in 1912, just to name a few. Butcher's Gardens regularly bought numerous plants, especially roses. and hundreds of ornamental trees were purchased by the city during the development of its many boulevards. So many claim that Layritz Nurseries was responsible through appropriate landscaping material for helping to make Victoria the city of gardens. And indeed, these years of inexhaustible prosperity for the nursery. Richard always had a flair for advertising the nursery, and he used his signature as a logo before this was common in commercial advertising. He purchased space on the front covers of the Victoria's early city directories. And here's his famous signature here, which you can see with the European Z on the end there. I guess he wants to see that. And today the Layritz Little League use that same logo on their t-shirts. The earliest catalogue of the Layritz Nursery still in existence is one dated autumn 1894, spring of 1895. In the preface to this publication, the following was written by Mr. Layritz in presenting to the consideration of my friends and the public this descriptive catalogue. I desire to return most sincere thanks for the generous patronage with which I have been favored in the past, and express my determination to merit continuance of this same by my principles, etc., etc., etc. So you can see he was really in for business. And at the end of this dissertation, it says, a cordial invitation is extended to all interested in horticulture to visit the nursery grounds situated at the corner of Wilkinson and Carey Roads. And his address here is Garnham Post Office, Victoria, BC. Now, where is Garnham Post Office? It was located in a house at the corner of Carey and Wilkinson. And the mail would come out by horse and buggy, be dropped off at Garnham's, and would be sorted and ready for people for pickup. One notice in the catalogue, fruit trees were offered at 25 cents each, or 1,000 for $125. And I won't read all the others, because that's considerable. These annual catalogues are eagerly sought after because listing the endless nursery stock and prices, they gave customers planting, pruning, spraying instructions, and of course information on landscaping, such as, for example, which rhododendrons will grow next best by the sea. There were instructions on how to visit the nursery situated at the intersection of Carey and Wilkinson. The 1895 catalogue suggests one should use the Royal Oak stagecoach, which leaves downtown from 611 Johnson Street at 9:30 a.m. It takes about an hour to reach the Royal Oak Hotel on the West Saanich Road, and then just only a short walk to Wilkinson Road, followed by a 15-minute walk down to the nursery. In 1901, one was to travel out on the VNS, the old Cordwood Express, leaving the city at Douglas at Fisgard at 7:45 a.m. And this was only a 15-minute ride out to Royal Oak Station. And followed by a 30-minute walk down to the nursery. And the 1922 catalogue says it's best to ride on the BC Electric Railway out the interurban to Wilkinson Station, and then just a pleasant walk up to the nursery. Yeah, that's right. Now, by the 1930s, there was bus service right to the nursery gates. Now, the location, which seemed a long way out of the city at that time, was never a problem for the business, because most people got around on foot anyway and thought nothing of walking for miles. The roads were rough, but the countryside was beautiful. Down through the years, the catalogs were full of hundreds of unsolicited testimonies from pleased customers. And one example here reads, October 23rd, 1895, the Barracks, Esquimalt. Dear Sir, I was glad to say I was more than satisfied with the 375 trees, a job lot from you last fall. I obtained other trees at the same time from another nursery, and must say that those supplied by you were far ahead of any that I planted, for the reason that care was taken in taking up of the young trees, and the roots were a mass of fiber instead of a few and badly mutilated sprouts as most others were. Yours truly, J. Peters. In writing of the Layritz Nurseries, the word in the plural form is used because what was considered the home nursery and head office on Wilkinson Road was only one of several branches that existed over the long period of the nursery's existence. The nursery was incorporated in 1923. The branch nurseries in Vancouver and Kelowna could then become part of the firm. The Kelowna nursery is now a housing development. And the Vancouver sales office and nursery were located at 2220 Kingsway, today a shopping center. And each of these branches had a manager that lived right on the place in a house. Now Layritz had two other enterprises, both waterfront properties in the Gordon Head area. And around 1900, the well-established in Victoria wished to build by the sea, a summer home not too far from the city. Most of these properties consisted of a few uncleared acres. In the first years of 1900, an acre of land in the Gordon Head area cost $25 to $30, but by 1907 had inflated to $60. Layritz's 12 acres with cottage on Barry Road, dated back to the early 1900s, and this land was originally part of the Charles Dodd holdings from 1859, and today the houses of Sumner Place subdivision are on that land. And during the 1940s and 1950s, Layritz also had 10 acres at the foot of Ash Hill, that's just up from Mount Douglas Park, belonging to the James Todd estate from 1857, where he once grazed his sheep. And this acreage today is a housing subdivision too. And both of the acreages were used for rose propagation and to grow fruit tree seedlings. And in Victoria, besides the 72 acres out on Wilkinson Road, the nursery ran a fairly large store in the 700 block of Fort Street, with an entrance off Blanchard Street through two large wooden doors. It's almost opposite, I should say very close to where Monk's Books and Stationery are today. And this led into a hilling in-ground directly behind the store. A hilling in-ground is a patch of open soil where they could put the plants below the ground level before people came to pick them up, because sometimes that took time. Through this entrance, the Layritz truck was able to deliver the plants and shrubs ordered previously by the city customers. Beginning in the 1930s, home deliveries were begun for all the people unable to come out to the nursery. And the store was opened in 1920, and it operated until 1958. Now, Layritz never sold seeds, bedding, plants, potted fresh flowers, and all the things that nurseries do today. At the store, orders were taken from Layritz's well-known catalogs, and this included shrubs, trees of all sizes, roses, rhododendrons, azaleas, fruit trees, and nothing else. Each fall, large quantities of fruit was picked from the 3-year seedlings out in Gordon Head. And this fruit was sold in wooden boxes constructed out at the nursery by the carpenter, and was a very popular item at the store. And each of these boxes sold for $1.50, and the box was included. And these boxes were big. And there's still the odd one shows up around the city with the logo on the side. I think I gave 2 to the Provincial Museum here. And each Christmas, Richard personally made dozens of wreaths and crosses from holly grown on his property. And I can remember as a very young child watching him working out on his veranda late into the night with his hands torn and bleeding from that prickly holly. And these were sold from the store for home decorating churches and cemeteries. And holly was extremely popular in that time of the year for various festivities. No doubt the busiest and most important time of the year was the packing and shipping season, usually running from the beginning of October until the middle of April. And hundreds of orders taken through the year would only be processed at this time. And the reason for that was the plants would be dormant. Today you'll go to a nursery and you'll buy a shrub or a tree or something, and you'll bring it home and you'll plant it, and you wonder why 2 or 3 months later it's died. Well, it's, you know, it was taken up at the wrong time of the year. Many well-known customers who personally preferred to select plants themselves came by taxi, private, or chauffeur car. A few of these was Mr. Butchard from the gardens, of course, with his head gardener. Although they sustained a plant propagation business themselves, they regularly bought from Layritz. And for many summers, the same 2 sisters of St. Anne's would arrive in their long black flowing gowns in the heat of the summer on their annual plant buying expedition, but would only be escorted around the nursery by Mr. Layritz himself. And of course there were head gardeners from the large estates around the city, and ordinary private citizens, and horticulturists from the United States who arrived regularly to choose unusual plants unobtainable in their area. And during this busy shipping season, it was essential to have an experienced work crew willing to put in a 10-hour day. A man was employed full-time just to work in the packing shed, where he cut burlap cloth into various sizes. Virtually all stock leaving the nursery had its root system packed in damp peat moss and then tightly sacked. There were no whalehide pots in those days. Gardeners were busy locating, digging, labeling the plants taken from the extensive order sheets. Others still in the ground had to be counted in huge lots for orders yet to be filled. And a carpenter was continually busy in the enormous packing shed, building large and small packing cases, fruit boxes, and large tree removal platforms. And Richard bought a piece of land at the west end of, just a small patch, at the west end of Swan Lake, that gave him access for the digging peat, for which he had earlier, of course, had permission from the Saanich municipalities. And the nurserymen in hip waders would wade out into the lake and rake this peat and load it into the nursery trucks. Dripping loads of this valuable material would be driven back to the nursery, where it was laid out in the fresh air, turned regularly, and when it was dried, it was stored away for next year's packing season. In the early years, horses played a major role in the nursery. They were not only used for plowing, cultivating, and carting, but to help with the threshing of their feed crops, which were grown right on the property, oats and wheat, enough to keep them alive all winter. And before truck transport, horse and cart delivered special orders of nursery stock to the downtown boat and rail terminals. And that was quite a tug, you know, for horses to take these heavy loads down. And of course there were numerous horses that came and went throughout the years. And they were lovingly cared for by the ploughman, Peter Gauntz, and Sheila and Morgan would remember him. He cared so much for his horses that he often slept with them in the barn, and whose Gaelic speech no one could really understand, not so much because of the dialect, but with this pipe that he always had clenched between his teeth. And he came to work for Layritz in the early 1890s, and he stayed for 50 years. For 50 years. And the break that Richard Layritz was looking for came when the interior of British Columbia became orchard-minded. In the Okanagan Valley, orders amounted to as much as 40,000 trees, or a freight car load full. Now, as 40,000 trees would plant 1,000 acres, and as there were few of any 1,000-acre orchard, one wonders who placed such orders. And I think perhaps, thinking on this subject, I think it was probably a group order, because the nursery had a network of resident agents who took orders in the different lakeside communities of the Okanagan and the Kootenays. And it was at this time that the Kelowna Nursery was established in order to take over this part of the business. And the nursery business was easier in the days of the big fruit tree sales. Such orders placed steadily year after year during the 1920s were the bread and butter years of the operation. Then suddenly the bottom fell out of the fruit tree industry. And that was the same time as the stock market fell. And Richard Layritz shipped 11 freight car loads of fruit trees down to Victoria in order to try to salvage some. But I'm afraid most of them ended up on the bonfire. It's however significant that the Great Depression years of the 1930s, as they took hold, the fruit tree boom ended. Other avenues had to be explored. And while fruit trees always remained part of the business, as did ornamental trees, shrubs, and roses, in the second phase of great importance became the rhododendrons and the azaleas. And before World War II, 1939-1945, Layritz Nurseries Limited began shipping worldwide. They had extensive markets in the Far East. British residents living in Hong Kong, remembering the roses that they had in England, were special customers, especially that these roses had to be replaced frequently in that hot, humid climate. From the beginning, Layritz employed Chinese help. At least 4 of these men remained faithful to him for many years. In the case of Hung Ben and later his nephew Hung Kai, it was over 30 years before either of them returned to China. And as was the custom of the day, Chinese men were not allowed to sponsor their wives or children to come to Canada. And it wasn't until after Second World War that the Exclusion Act was repealed. Each month, these nursery Chinese would send a sum of money back to China for their wives' income. Now, as these men were of different tongs, rivalry often broke out among them. So they had to live individually. This was out on the Wilkinson Road property, in their own little scattered grey shacks. In the early days, they were responsible for the many chores such as chopping wood, fetching wood, feeding the chickens and the ducks, and even growing the kitchen garden. But later, as they became more skilled, they were able to work with the planting the thousands of cuttings in the greenhouses, or the shade houses. He had about 2 acres of just shade houses alone for rhododendrons and azaleas. During the summer season, unskilled help was often hired. Many willing men were anxious for a job, especially during the Depression years. Richard Layritz was known to frequently give a man on the relief program a few days of work. Trusted patients from the provincial mental institution just a quarter of a mile away were willing to work for a week or two at a time. They were put to hoeing down the weeds between the long rows of plants too narrow for the horse and plow to pass through. Only once did a patient try to escape, causing quite a commotion among the others. At the sound of the mental institution whistles at 11:15 and 4:30 p.m., they were walked back with their guards for meals. And it was quite a sight to see this. There'd be about 30 of them would come up to the nursery. And in fact, these whistles governed the lives of most people within hearing distance. And children especially hated that 4:30 whistle because it meant it was time we had to get home to start evening chores. And as I attended Strawberry Vale School, our recess period was regulated to the 11:15 whistle. In July, during the hottest weather, one of the most important jobs at the nursery was rose budding. This usually required 6 skilled gardeners to bud, followed closely behind by 6 workers, often senior summer students. They would hoe out the rows, tie up, and then hoe back the soil. And roses, of course, were budded at ground level or slightly behind, so it was very important to get this work completed before the new bud. Otherwise, it would not unite properly with the cambium layer of the stem. Now, it usually took about a month to complete working on 10 acres of wild briar planted the previous year, and this briar was obtained from Holland and Belgium. Records indicate that as many as 300,000 roses were grown on Wilkinson Road property, and in my student years at college I've done this work, and I can truthfully say it is the hottest, dirtiest, back-breaking work that was ever done. Hello?
I worked there too. But
you did that too?
Yeah.
And what were you doing?
Just budding roses.
Were you doing the roses, tying up?
Both down in Wilkinson and over in...
Oh, and Gordon Head too?
Head,
yeah. 3 ties above and 4 below?
Yeah.
Oh gracious, that was a terrible job. And following budding, another essential job was the preparation of the thousands of tiny evergreen and herbaceous cuttings. And these were planted in the greenhouse with great care, as of course they would become saleable material the following year. And the next summer the little plants would be transferred to the outside cold frames and eventually out into the nursery. And somewhere in between all this work was the washing of many thousands upon thousands of clay plant pots. Yes, Sheila. During summer holidays, as a young child of 11 and 12, I took on this job with a school friend. It was all done in a very primitive sort of way. 2 large wooden tubs filled with cold, disinfected water would be set up on a platform in front of us. And here we stood all day washing these pots with our scrubbers, nothing more than a piece of burlap tied around a stick. The clean pots were placed in large wooden crates and set out in the sun to dry. And of course we were supervised because occasionally this water would have to be replaced. And at the end of a couple of weeks, 2 very sunburned girls with very little skin left on their fingers would show up at the office door for our pay of $15 each. And Layritz Nurseries was a prominent exhibitor at the horticultural shows throughout the Pacific Northwest, as far south as San Francisco and the well-known Portland Rose Festival. There were numerous exhibitions in Vancouver and Victoria, including the popular Spring Exhibition and the horticultural shows which were out at the Willows exhibition. And here's one picture of one of the exhibits that was presented at the Willows, and I think there's 65 boxes of fruit on display. In 1923, Richard formed a partnership with Major H.D. Seal, who acted as secretary-treasurer for many years. He was a very tall, gentlemanly, English, Cambridge-educated, a soldier of the World War I, who was, as a veteran, was looking for a new career. Seal traveled widely for the firm within Western Europe to purchase from leading nurseries and estates rare and interesting plants. The nursery was always on the lookout for new varieties of nursery stock, growing them and assessing them and recommending them before their finds. Although Richard Layritz and Major Seal were nothing like each other in appearance, one was 5 foot tall and one was 6 foot tall, they actually were very well suited to each other and got along very well. Richard disliked paperwork and could now leave the office work to Seal and devote all of his time each day to the nursery. And 4 years later, it was necessary to hire more office help. And in 1927, Richard persuaded his nephew, Martin Layritz, who was my father, a chartered accountant who was working in New York City at a large firm, to come and join the firm. Martin was the son of Richard's older brother, who had arranged for him to attend horticultural college in Stuttgart. And both Major Seal and Martin Layritz stayed at the firm for over 30 years. During the 1939-1945 war years, the Canadian Army used a portion of the Wilkinson Road property bordering on Glen Road for a listening station. A high wireless tower was erected and the land enclosed with barbed wire. Total secrecy prevailed and guarded around the clock by armed soldiers. And during the same time, the RCAF built a gigantic wooden arrow-shaped object on the Gordon Head property in the cherry tree orchard. And small wartime planes from Patricia Bay flew over, dropping bags of flour using the arrow for target practice. The noise of the planes annoyed the neighbors and made a pleasant Sunday afternoon at the cottage rather unbearable. And on February 23, 1950, an illustrated article appeared in both Victoria Times and Daily Colonist describing a shipment of all Canadian trees prepared by the nursery bound for Yokohama, Japan, aboard the Canadian Blue Line ship, the Island Mail, where they would shade the graves of the Canadian war dead. Now, Richard Layritz was married twice. His first wife, Elizabeth Vetter, born in 1883, was only 21 when she married 38-year-old Richard in their hometown of Hohenstein and Ernstthal on January 21st, 1906. She'd known him all her life, and they'd been corresponding for years. She was a lovely young cultured lady and a fine pianist. On the day following their marriage, they left for Victoria, and she brought all her worldly possessions with her in various trunks, containing fine clothes, china, books, beautiful linens, so many goods that the customs house man in Victoria asked her if she intended to set up shop. It must have been a rude awakening for her when she arrived in the isolated, primitive surroundings out on Wilkinson Road. At the beginning of World War I, all contact with her relatives and friends back home was suddenly terminated, and indeed an extremely depressing time for her. In an effort to console her sorrows, Richard bought her a beautiful Heinzmann player piano and had it shipped from Seattle. But soon she became quite ill and died shortly after, October 4th, 1916, in St. Joseph's Hospital. She was only 32, and Richard was devastated, and he mourned her all his life, and we never mentioned her name in front of him. Richard's second wife, Dorothy Giles, was born in 1882 in London. She was 36 when they were married in February 1919, and she'd been working at the nursery before Major Seal's time as Richard's secretary. And she'd only been living in Victoria a few years, previously working as a nanny for the Amos family at Elk Lake. Arriving in Victoria after World War I, she found many English-speaking people living here, therefore it wasn't difficult for her to find friends. Many of them living in the Royal Oak district are connected with St. Michael's and All Angels Church, of which she was a member. Dorothy absolutely dreaded threshing time during the heat of the summer when she had to prepare the enormous meals for the work crew. There were no children born to either of Richard's two marriages, and this was a great pity, as it would certainly have influenced the final outcome of the nursery. Richard Layritz always lived the simple life of a pioneer, never far from the earth, which gave him his good health and the energy to achieve success. His home was simply furnished, but had a warm and friendly atmosphere. Although he became financially successful, work was continually spoken of with reverence. Richard often said, "It's a pleasure to be able to work. One must work to keep happy." He was a small, erect man, just 5 feet tall, with a white mustache, had a military bearing, but a quiet speaking voice. Richard was born with a fine singing voice and had sung in European choirs as a young man, especially the well-known Musikverein from Dresden. I well remember him singing at family gatherings, particularly at Christmas. He was a member of St. Michael's and All Angels Church and choir, and he was known for his beautifully handwritten letters in both English and German, and his Latin was his vast knowledge, was always continually sought after. Perhaps I should mention at this time that people of German origin were in a very awkward position during World War I. Anti-German sentiment was deeply felt among the city's British population, whose young men were dying in great numbers on the Western Front in Europe. In May of 1915, the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, was torpedoed by a German submarine and sank with heavy loss of life. And also on that sinking was the James Dunsmuir of Hatley Castle, his son, his only son. Outrage was felt around the world. Victoria was the scene of 2 days of anti-German rioting. Hundreds of men raided the Kaiserhof Hotel, cornered at the corner of Blanchard and Pandora Streets. And that later became the Kent Apartments, and it's still standing today. It has a signature on top that it was built in 1891. And they went into the Kaiserhof, they drank all the liquor, wrecked the interior, and threw the furniture out into the street. Then they went to the German club, smashed it up, and threw the piano out of the second floor window. And that was located on Government Street. Next they raided Simon Liesler's large wholesale grocery on Yates Street, and were threatening the Phoenix Brewery on Government Street when the militia was called in. There were threats made against Lieutenant Governor Francis Barnard, whose wife was German. Now Richard Layritz, though and a lot of other German-born residents were loyal British subjects. In 1894, he had taken out Canadian nationalization papers. He belonged to the Church of England, sang in the Anglican Church choir. But there's a story in the family that tells how the nursery escaped vandalism in the aftermath of the Lusitania, thanks to a tram driver. A group of loud, rowdy men had clambered aboard in Victoria the BC Electric Interurban Railway, bent on damaging Layritz's property. Only they didn't know where they were going, as the countryside suddenly became rural. Overhearing their plans, the tram driver, who knew of the Layritz Nursery and where it was located, sidetracked them. He let them off at Tillicum and told them if they walked down to the gorge, they'd soon find the nursery down there. He was never bothered. The nursery was never ever bothered again. Like all members of the Layritz family, Richard was very healthy and living until into their late 80s and into their 90s. He was known in the winter to come into the house soaking wet, refusing to change his clothes until the day's work was completed. And a long-time employee once said that man must be made of steel. He was the first man out in the morning and the last man to quit in the evening. His dawn to dusk worker viewed gardening as a religion, refusing to sell tender plants to people he thought wouldn't look after them. He regarded plants not only from an economical aspect, but from a philosophical point of view. To him, plants must be treated with the same respect as man, and this sometimes led him into trouble with his clients. Once a wealthy woman asked Richard for some plants that would require a great deal of attention. And after he asked her about her garden, he knew he couldn't sell her those plants. But why, she said, I've got the money to pay for them. You won't take care of them, the sale's off, Richard brusquely replied. On another occasion, he gave some blue cedars to his old friend, Canon Fred Comley, who was the rector of St. Michael's Church. A few weeks later, the clergyman complained that his plants were not doing very well. Well, you don't love them enough, Richard scolded. Love them and they will grow. In the dark of the evenings, Richard worked at the kitchen table, making tags for digging or cuttings to plant in the greenhouse the next day. With weather-beaten and gnarled but unbelievably nimble hands, he could bud roses so fast that it took 2 good men to tie up behind him. In time, the firm grew in size and importance to become one of the largest nurseries on the Pacific coast, and the stock the most varied. Thousands of different kinds of plants, shrubs, and trees weren't just sold locally, but shipped all over North America, to Western Europe, China, and Japan. Gardeners and nurserymen who followed him were able to take advantage of Layritz's trials and errors with new plant introductions from abroad. In 1951, this pioneer horticulturist looked back on a rather secluded but fulfilling life in his Wilkinson Road nursery, where he produced and developed countless plant varieties with his knowledge constantly sought after. Early one spring day in 1951, at 86 years, after a lingering look at the acres of greenery he had created, Richard Layritz reluctantly retired from the business. He walked into the head office and told my father, Martin Layritz, that his time had come to give it up. For a few moments the 2 men looked at each other. Finally, Father said, "Uncle, this is a sad, sad day." There was nothing further to say. He'd often warned his uncle of that day, but the reply was always the same. "Oh, surely there's no reason why the nursery shouldn't continue to operate after I'm gone." Of course, unfortunately, this was not to be. Martin Layritz remained at the nursery, the last man to do so, until his 72nd birthday. His was the painful and thankless job of passing the old nursery in 1958 over to an unsuccessful new management. And I'll always remember the day my father walked down Wilkinson Road carrying the cushion off his office chair. As his constant interest in local affairs, Richard Layritz in 1953, 1 year before his death, deeded the municipality of Saanich a 10-acre plot of land on the western boundary of the home nursery. His wish for this land that it become a perpetual park. It became the home of the successful Layritz Little League Baseball Club. And in her time, his wife Dorothy donated an additional 5 acres of land in his memory. She was present at the May 10, 1963 opening of the baseball season and the dedication ceremony. And according to the Daily Colonist, nearly 1,000 people attended, included 250 children in baseball uniforms, a band and municipal dignitaries. Dorothy Layritz said her husband, who liked children, would have gotten a real thrill out of this. As Richard approached his 87th birthday, his health began to decline. On Easter weekend, April 2, 1954, he entered St. Joseph's Hospital for observation. He never left the hospital again. And after 5 months of long and painful weeks, he finally passed away, September 10, 1954. A few weeks after the funeral, family, close friends, and long-time workmen, many of them over 40 years, came out to the nursery. I should say met at the nursery just off the side of Wilkinson Road, about 2 yards in, beneath a sequoia tree. This magnificent tree was planted from an original seed in 1889 by Richard's own hand. The nursery is recorded as having started when seed of Sequoia gigantea was planted. It had been his wish that this be his final resting place. Martin Layritz scattered his ashes into the ground, and the faithful workmen spread rose petals over the grave. A brass plaque on the tree today reads, "In memory, after his life's work well done, he rests now in peace under his beloved sequoia tree, Richard Layritz, 27th of April, 1867, 10th of September, 1954. And Dorothy Layritz lived in their home until she died 20 years later at 92. And Layritz's house is still occupied today. It was one of the first houses in Saanich to qualify for the heritage plaque and be listed in the Saanich Registry of the Residential Buildings of Historical Merit. 20 years following the death of her husband, Dorothy died on October 6, 1974, as I said, at 92, in the Gorge Hospital. Her wish was to have her ashes buried next to her husband. Now, a Victoria Times newspaper article dated October 12, 1974, stated that wish may not be granted, although Saanich Parks Committee vowed the night of her funeral to do all it can to make this happen. During the very week of her death, and in the following months, many articles appeared in the Times and the Daily Colonist newspapers concerning the future of that tree. The problem was the tree stood on land sold to Layritz Farms Limited. The property on Wilkinson Road was divided into 5 sections, and one large section was called Layritz Farms, and that was the parcel in which the tree stood, was about 3 acres. They did not wish to give up 20 square foot memorial plot just off the side of Wilkinson Road and close to an unused building. Also, this land was under the Provincial Government Agricultural Land Reserve Act, which made it subject to certain restrictions. But at that time, the mayor of Saanich, Edward Lum, had just attended the funeral of Dorothy Layritz, and he remembered the 20 acres of land the Layritz family deeded to the municipality. Mayor Lum agreed to head a movement to save the tree, planted 17 years before the municipality was born, and stressed that tree lovers everywhere should join in this. And Saanich Council tried to negotiate with Layritz Farms in an unsuccessful attempt to buy the plot of land on which the tree stood. The public outcry continued, and it was learned that there was a proposal to create a mobile home subdivision and perhaps an outdoor theater on that property. Fortunately, that never materialized. And finally, on May 1st, 1975, almost a year later, a part-time sheep farmer and carpenter, Gordon Barker, and his brother David of Vancouver purchased the land known as Layritz Farms, his property off Glen Road, bordered on Layritz Park. Now, he knew Richard very well, and once said he remembered the time when he kept rabbits and they got loose and killed a lot of the nursery's young fruit trees. Well, Mr. Barker had wanted to purchase the land for 20 years and was determined to preserve the trees, the plants, and the buildings. And he also promised to work with Saanich to protect the tree for posterity, and so forth. And so eventually it was saved and protected, and she was able to, her wish was therefore granted. Two interesting things here. Richard was quite an artist too in his spare time, and he used to love to draw and paint pictures of his, those are peonies obviously, and there's numbers beside the pictures here, and obviously they would be recorded in the catalog. Gorgeous. You've now seen it?
Yes,
they're just beautiful. And sort of a fun thing here. Here's a calendar from 1896, and he used to write his expenses and his receipts on the backs of his calendar in the early years, and it's rather fascinating looking down on them, what he had purchased, 15 cents worth of oatmeal, and the Times newspaper was $2 a year, and the $3 passage to Vancouver hotel, $2, and so on and so forth, which is rather fascinating. There's a lot more artifacts which are in the Saanich archives. Anyone interested, you can go and you can see them all. These are some of the later catalogs. I didn't pass these around. This is the wartime one. And then there's this one here, which was the last one.
Did he do that of the roses?
Yes, yes, yes. I don't know if there's any questions, if anyone would like. Yes.
Is the tree still standing?
Pardon?
Is it? The tree still
Oh
standing?
yes, absolutely. Yes, it's well protected. It's over 100 feet high. You can drive down Wilkinson Road and you can see it. It's right near beside the road.
Wasn't he responsible for the big sequoia and Butchart Gardens as well?
Yes, oh yes, oh yes. Many of them around Victoria. There's a huge one there on the parking lot of St. Luke's Church here. That's well known.
One about where your driveway was?
Yes, there's about 7 of them that are historical. And at one time you could go to the top of Mount Tommy on a nice sunny summer day, and you could just gaze out and you could see them. You could pick them out. You could actually see them because of their conical shape.
Well, there's so many people in the state up from California.
So they say, but that's not so.
Oh.
No, that's not so, no.
Where did it come from?
It came from a seed house in Victoria here. There was a place in Victoria that was importing seeds and various things. This sequoia here, the Sequoia gigantea, people get that confused all the time with the California redwood. They're nothing like one another at all. The Sequoia gigantea originated in Nevada, high up in the Sierra Mountains. And they're not the easiest thing to grow. There's a huge one on the grounds of course, the legislature, which they decorate at Christmas, you know, Christmas lights. Various others around. They live to be a tremendous age, actually. They can live to be 1,000 years old, so I've been told. Yes, right.
Well, this has been a wonderful talk, especially for we who grew up on Wilkinson Road. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, that's
it's really wonderful.
Well, it was a pleasure.
He was telling me that you could put a Bartlett pear tree into a hawthorn bush.
Oh no.
Me being a stupid kid, I figured he was just pulling my leg.
I don't
But I did it, it worked.
It actually worked?
It worked.
Is that a fact? Well, isn't that interesting? Well, for goodness sakes. Yes, there were two Georges at the nursery. There was George Fagerberg and George Watling. And they were always, both of them worked for over 40 years for the firm. And one was called Big George and one was called Little George.
Right. George Fagerberg did a Little George.
Yes, right, right.
Next door to George Fagerberg's, there was 3 sisters.
Yes.
That were Fagerbergs as well.
Yes, they were. Actually, it was 2. There
Oh.
were 3 at one time, Sheila, but one 12-year-old, she drowned in a well on the property there, yes. And there was just Claire and Elsa left, and neither of them married.
Were they related to George?
Oh, yes, they were his sisters.
Oh, his sisters.
Yes, they were his sisters, right.
So vague memories of them.
Well, I attend St. Michael's Church.
Yes.
Still, and there is a hedge, there a yew tree hedge that was donated by Mr. Layritz.
Oh, yes,
It's
right.
still there. And Mr. Layritz also helped construct the bell tower on the church.
Yes, that's
It's in our
right.
history book. Mr. Layritz
Yes.
helped raise it.
I believe there's a plaque, a brass plaque on a pew in that church there with his name on it. I've never seen it, but I've been told. So I guess in the early day, you know, different people donated money for pews and such like. Right.
Well, you've done a lot of work there.
It's
You've
extraordinary.
researched, you know, it's
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
It's almost, I was thinking myself, it was